Welcome back to EDH on a Budget. Today we're going to be going over the final part for White Land Ramp. This section I like to call the catch-up ramp because these cards only work if opponents have more lands than you, and we're going to be going over how to make that a likely thing to happen in the game, but also not a downside or not as big of a downside. First up, we have Knight of the White Orchid. A lot of people will know this card. It's white creature, human knight 2/2 stats with first strike. When Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you may search your library for a plains card and put it onto the battlefield. So this is one of the better catch-up land ramps for white because it doesn't say the plains enters tapped. It doesn't say a basic plains. So there's lots of dual and tri lands that have subtypes, and some of them have the subtype plains, so you could get that onto the battlefield if you wanted to help fix your colors. First strike on a 2/2 body it's always nice. It's gonna avoid some chump attackers, and ways to make this happen where it's more likely to happen, you don't even necessarily need to try that hard, because if you're going first is the only time you would have to try at all, because if you're going second, then the person in front of you is already going to have more land. Assuming they hit their turn 3 land drop, they're going to have more lands than you. So this isn't something you play on turn 2 typically, unless somebody ramped with a land on turn 1. Also, another way to make this happen is with bounce lands. Bounce lands will return a land to the battle from the battlefield to your hand. Your land count is going to appear to be less, even though that land's tapping for more. So that's another way to get this to trigger. There's also cards like Field Mist Border Post. It's an artifact that pretty much nobody ever plays. The mana cost is 1 white and blue. This artifact has, you may tap this to add a white or a blue. It enters the battlefield tapped. But here's the part where this works with these kinds of decks. It says you may pay 1 and return a basic land you control to its owner's hand rather than pay Field Mist Border Post mana cost. So here's how this would look in it. If you wanted to get this out as soon as possible, you play a plains or any basic land. You tap that for 1 mana. You play this by returning that land to your hand. This enters the battlefield tapped. Turn 2, play that basic plains, ideally, and then you could play Knight of the White Orchid, assuming you didn't go first. And what would happen is the player in front of you would have already had 2 lands. You only have 1 land and this. So it would see that they have more. You would ramp your land onto the battlefield. So in a way, this it kind of works together, and you might want to consider them if you're going to run these catch-up lands. There's other cards like Daze. Daze is a blue card, instant, 1 and a blue. It says you may return an island you control to its owner's hand rather than pay Daze's mana cost, and has counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. I'm not saying you have to run this. This is a free counter spell if, assuming they don't have 1 mana to sink into it. So it's not the best counter spell, but I'm using this as an example. Blue has lots of cards that can return islands or a land card from the battlefield to your hand. Red has lots of ways to alternate casting costs that usually involve sacrificing a land. Cards like Ghost Quarter sacrifice itself to destroy a land, but you don't get that land back.
Field of Ruin. That destroys target land, and then every player searches their library for a basic land card and puts it onto the battlefield. I don't remember if it's tapped or not, but what's going to happen is you and that player both lost a land. You both get a land, so you're neutral on lands, but then the other two players who didn't lose the land, they will be up on lands. And that will trigger, or not trigger, but that will allow all of this ramp to be effective. I don't think you could run a deck full of this catch-up ramp and get more than one if unless you're doing this stuff to make it work. It's also the next card is Boreas Charger. Knight of the White Orchid is 60 cents. Boreas Charger is 15 cents. It is a Pegasus with 2/1 stats. It costs 2 and a white. Has flying. When Boreas Charger leaves the battlefield, choose an opponent who controls more lands than you. Search your library for a number of plains cards equal to the difference. Reveal those cards. Put one of them onto the battlefield and the rest into your hand. So this is nice in that it doesn't just get you one land. It might get you one land to the battlefield, but the extra lands will go to your hand, so kind of sets you up if somebody is really ramping hard with the lands. If you're going to play these lands, I definitely don't recommend throwing in cards like Wayfarer's Bauble, Solemn Simulacrum, and etc. Because if they're not going to work together. Solemn, yes, will always work, and Wayfarer will always work, but do you really want cards that work once and turn off all the rest of your ramp? This card, Boreas Charger, you can flicker it because it's a leave the battlefield effect. You can sacrifice it, you can have it block. I don't think anybody's going to avoid attacking you because, oh, well, you're going to get another land. No, and this only has 1 toughness, so it's very easy to block something and have this die. There's also the fact that this gets a plains, not a basic plains, so again, you can get those dual and tri lands. You can also get those, there's a subtype of plains cards that have added abilities to them, and you could get those if you have them. Next up, we have a fairly common one, Keeper of the Accord. It's a human soldier creature for 3/4 stats, and it costs 3 and a white. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more creatures, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more lands than you may search your library for plains, a basic plains, and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So this does get just a basic plains, and it enters the battlefield tapped, so you don't get to use it. It has the added benefit of creating creatures, which is probably going to happen more often. I'm not sure how often you're going to be able to ramp. Like, I doubt you're going to be able to ramp on every player's turn every time. But if you look at it from the perspective of how many lands do you really want for 4 mana, like, if you get 2 lands, that's pretty good for white. And the creatures, I mean, you throw this in a token-heavy deck, and that takes advantage of those creatures entering the battlefield. You could have Mentor of the Meek. White has so many ways to draw cards from a small little chump 1/1 creature token entering the battlefield that it is great for white decks. 4 mana, some people might say it's kind of high, but it just does what white needs. And at only 33 cents, it is easily affordable for many white decks. Next up will be the most expensive card of this section. For $2.50, it is Deep Gnome Terramancer. It is a gnome wizard with 2/2 stats. It costs 1 and a white. This creature has flash, so you can cast it at any time, and it has whenever 1 or more lands enter the battlefield under an opponent's control. Without being played, you may search your library for a plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Do this only once each turn. So there's a lot of ways to trigger this. It says without being played, so that means they're ramp spells that put the lands onto the battlefield, like Farseek, 3 Visits, Nature Lore, so on and so forth. Those cards are not played, they're put onto the battlefield. So that would trigger this. Myriad Landscape, if they activate it, that would trigger this. There's ways to force this to happen. Like I said, with the Ghost Quarter, Demolition Field, Field of Ruin, that is all stuff that is going to either force them to put the land onto the battlefield, or I guess they could choose not to for some of those cards and then just go down a land, but they're not going to do that. They're not going to willingly go down lands when they could get one. So you're going to get that Plains card. Again, it is not a basic. It does enter the battlefield tapped, but having Flash is very, very nice for this creature. Being able to hold up your mana. You don't know if you're going to want to remove something, or maybe you see that, hey, if I cast this, I'm going to get that land right away. So they're not going to play around it, but being able to use this at instant speed is really nice. I'd say it's well worth the $2.50, and if you haven't given it a shot, you definitely should give it a chance. This is the cheapest it's been in what I think is quite a while. If I go back to the 1 year mark, it was about $5 last March. Alright, next we have Stoic Farmer for 23 cents. Stoic Farmer is a creature, dwarf, peasant, 3/3 stats, costs 3 and a white, has Foretell, so you can pay 2, exile this from your hand, and then another turn you can pay 1 and a white. So the way that works out is you could do this on turn 2 and then play it on turn 3, even though overall you sink 4 mana into this. So it could ramp you on turn 3, and that is where I want to do my ramping. Turns 1 to 3 ideally. And it also has, when Stoic Farmer enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic Plains card, reveal it. If an opponent controls more lands than you, put it onto the battlefield tapped, otherwise put it into your hand. So most of the catch-up ramp cards won't do anything if they control the same amount of lands as you or less. So this is nice in that it will always at least go to your hand. You're going to gain that card or put ramp. It's not going to do nothing. It is a basic Plains, and it does enter the battlefield tapped, so those are the two weaker sides of the catch-up ramp that I usually avoid. So if you're looking for extra synergies, with the dwarf peasant, you're not going to get many creature types for tribal decks in those stats, and with 3 power, it's going to avoid most of the card draw in white, and its 4 CMC is going to it's going to avoid that card draw for white also. In the future, I'll go over how white draws best, but typically it wants low power, low CMC creatures entering the battlefield. This is a pretty good flicker target, though, and that's probably where this card would really shine. Being able to flicker it over and over again gets you some card draw where you're drawing the Plains, or ramp. Next up, we have Cartographer's Hawk. This is 2 cents. Stoic Farmer was 23 cents if I didn't say that. Cartographer's Hawk is a creature for 1 and a white. Has 2/1 stats with flying. It's a bird. When it deals combat damage to a player who controls more lands than you, return it to its owner's hand. If you do, you may search your library for a Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Again, it does not say basic Plains, but it does say tapped, so it's kind of middle of the road as far as how it's ramping. It does have to deal combat damage to the player that has more lands than you, so that is also another strike against this, that hoping that this gets through there. Bouncing it to your hand, it's not really that big of a deal with it only being 2 mana, and white, pretty much all of white's card draw, repeated card draw, would draw from you casting this. No flicker ways to abuse it there. You could double the triggered ability if you had the right artifacts in the deck, but I don't know. If this card gets one ramps just once, that's enough for me for 2 mana. If you're Plains card hoping to get 2, 3, 4 lands, I don't think you're gonna get it. But it's also just 2 mana. In white, 2 mana, if you get a land, that's really good. A really good rate for white. Next is Loyal Warhound for 65 cents. Its mana cost is 1 and a white, has 3/1 stats, it's a dog. Has Vigilance. When Loyal Warhound enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So it does get just a basic, and it does enter the battlefield tapped, so those are the weaker forms of this ketchup ramp. 3/1 body, not bad. And Vigilance, whatever. But this is basically the standard, I'd say, for the ketchup ramp. Like this is what you think of when you say ketchup ramp. In white, I think a lot of people think of this. It's not the best, not the worst. It's kind of middle of the road, and it's just a good card. Remember, like I said, how to get these all to trigger with the Field of Ruin and etc. And bouncing lands. It's easy to get this to reliably trigger, and if you're not going first, it's pretty much guaranteed to trigger, even if you did nothing. So all that extra ways that I talked about with the bounce lands and all that, that's to get these cards to trigger more than once. You have a 75% chance of them happening once without doing anything. And those cards help ensure that they'll happen once no matter what, even if you do go first. And that is it. That is how white ramps. If you want me to go over a certain color or colorless next, let me know. I plan to go over eventually all the colors of how they can ramp with lands specifically. I know there are certain cards that are white mana rocks, or maybe there's some white mana dorks, other ways to reduce mana costs, and etc. Right now, I'm just going over land ramp. So if you have a certain color that you're trying to build and you're stuck, let me know. Hit me up in the comments or etc. Hit the like, share, and subscribe button. Help grow the channel, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.